Good afternoon. So you join me at home, even though it's the bank holiday weekend. It's the Friday of the Easter holidays today, and it's a lovely day outside. It's about 20 something degrees, nice and sunny. So why aren't I at the beach? Well, viruses, lockdown, so stuck indoors still. So I thought what I would do, seeing as I can't be out and about taking pictures, is go back through some images from Senja in Norway, where I was last September. And I've dug out one or two raws, which at the time I didn't really do a lot with, didn't think they were the best shots, and sort of skipped over processing those. And just see if a sort of second look a few months later yields anything worthwhile from them. So basically, you can watch along at how I process these images. There might be something you find interesting that you didn't know. I might show you something new in Lightroom. You might think the way I've chosen to process these is also terrible, which is fine. It's a pretty individual choice, so feel free to drop in the comments how you feel. I've basically picked out 4 images, depending on how long it takes to go through each one. I may split this into 2 separate videos, but we'll see how we go for time. I don't want you to sit here watching me for an hour because it'll be pretty boring. Also, forgive the hair. Didn't get a chance to go to a barber's before they all closed. Normally I get it done at work, which is nice, but missed him as well. And haven't yet been brave enough to let the other half loose with the scissors, but it's getting towards the point where I might have to. Anywho, right, hop over into Lightroom and take a look at the files that I'm going to go through. Okay, so I've picked 4 different images to have a go at processing, all taken in Senja. Like I say, if you've not been there, I highly recommend it, especially in the autumn. Plenty of nice colour. So the images I've picked, this was a fairly small little waterfall I stumbled across. Lots of low cloud that day, and it was sort of a fairly dramatic scene when I was there. I'd actually tried to get an image of this pointed peak a couple of days before, but it was so shrouded in cloud you couldn't even see it. The reason I didn't process this one at the time, I think there's too much foreground of this sort of moss and greenery here. It's not sort of fitting into the image that well. It's a bit too dominant. Not quite sure about the rock down here and the water disappearing around it. It looks a bit like this is sort of disappearing off the side of the screen. But we'll have a go. The next image I've picked is actually from the same location, but rather than the waterfall, I shot here because I quite liked these different coloured bushes and trees. Like I say, there was some nice autumn colour, which doesn't immediately appear on the raw files. They're obviously fairly flat straight out of the camera. But again, it was a little bit messy, I thought, so I'm not entirely sure, but we'll again see what we can do with it. The next image with a horrific dust spot down there. This was taken looking at the Devil's Teeth Mountains, which are nicely jagged here, but obviously they're under some heavy cloud. But I did quite like that the sun was illuminating the bottom of the clouds here and also just picking out on the mountain. It's a bit sort of one-sided, I guess. You know, there's a lot of mountain on this side and nothing on this side, but we'll have a look. And then the final image is this one. I took this with a fairly long lens looking down this road, and this is the same Devil's Teeth type mountains in the background, but because of the long lens compressing the perspective, they look much more imposing and tall. But it's a pretty messy scene otherwise. There's these red poles, there's this telegraph pole and these wires across the middle of the image. There was some roadworks, so there's a bunch of little signs and stuff down here, and a car. So I think what I'm going to do with this one is actually try and get rid of a lot of that, which will be an interesting test of the Photoshop sort of spot removal type tool. Anyway, we'll see when we get to that one last, but for now, go back to the first image. So, for the first image here, I think the first thing I want to do is experiment with cropping a little bit. Obviously I shot this in portrait format, but I think I'm actually going to knock it back from that aspect ratio to more of a 4:3, just to remove some of that foreground, and also, although that little rock was there, it's not particularly interesting, and I can also just drag in just to remove that rock, and I kind of prefer that. It's got rid of a lot of distraction in that bottom right hand corner, which I think just makes it a slightly cleaner image. So the next thing to do is apply the landscape profile, which just brings out the colours a little bit more, and I always just like to then hit the auto button just to see what that does with an image as a starting point. So there we go. The sky is obviously a little bit bright, so what I can do is just pull down a grad which we can play with, drop the highlights, maybe drop the exposure a little bit more. I'm trying to sort of pull out a bit of drama into this scene really, but that's obviously darkening the mountains, so I shall then lift the shadows back up a little bit, ease off on that one touch. Okay, the next thing I want to do is try and just get some of this foliage around here in the sort of bottom 2/3 of the image just to stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to pull up a grad filter in the opposite direction, and then apply a bit of clarity. Not loads, I mean that's too much, but just a little bit there, and a tiny smidge of texture. That just helps things stand out a little bit more. The sky up here has actually got a bit of a blue tinge to it, so I think the white balance is slightly cooler than I really want. So I'm just going to pick up the dropper here and just go and pop that on a bit of bluish looking cloud, and that gives us a sort of slightly more warm feeling, which when I was there it was pretty warm. The light was quite low, but it was coming through a lot of mist. I don't know that it was this warm, so I'm just going to ease this back off a couple of notches, maybe to about there. The other thing I remember when I was there is that the autumn colours were sort of more pronounced than they are in this photo. So the other thing I can do, rather than warming up the whole image, is come through to the individual colours here, and obviously we can play with making things green or orange. I don't think it needs a huge adjustment, so I'm probably just going to pull it down to around there, and maybe just lighten those up a little bit, maybe increase saturation. You can see the effect that has, and actually it's there's quite a lot of other orange bits of foliage there that are going to be under the orange channel rather than this yellow channel. So what I might do is ease that one there, and we'll move this orange, obviously not into complete red because it looks crazy, and add a little bit of saturation on those as well. Do we want to make them brighter? No, I think we'll leave that where it is. So that is coming on. What I did with a lot of the images that I took when I was there was then open them up in Color Efex and do a little bit of processing in there as well. There's a couple of tools I quite often use. So what we'll do is say edit in and pick Color Efex, and we'll wait for that to load up. Okay, so here we are in Color Efex, and what I always often do is add this cross-processing filter, which if I just whack up the strength of it, you'll see it sort of gives a nice teal and orange type effect, but I don't ever apply it with this much strength. So here we are back down at nothing. I tend to stick it just fairly low, sort of 17%. I think that looks okay. It just gives a nice a nice bit of toning to the image, but it is fairly subtle if I just turn that off and on. And we can maybe go a little bit higher as well. Yeah, I quite like that. The other thing I also like to do is use the where are we? Dark and Light and Center filter. So this one is similar to applying a vignette, but it's kind of a lot more subtle. In fact, if I apply a vignette, I think it's the lens one maybe, we can choose how much to apply, but it makes the edges of the image like really dark. It's sort of a bit too vignette-y. I much prefer this one. It's a lot more subtle, so I can turn down the border luminosity all the way down, and even then we don't get those really black edges. I tend to leave it around there. And again, if I just turn that on and off, you'll see when it's on, it just sort of draws the eye to the centre of the image a little bit more. So I'd still like, ideally, a little bit more drama up in the sky, but I'm not sure if I can achieve that without kind of ruining the mountains. But what I will try is just popping on a graduated filter, so we can see where that's applying. Make the blend a bit more and shift that up towards the top of the image, and we can ease that back off again. So that's with none. I think maybe just a little bit there will do quite nicely. Yeah, that's not too bad. Other filters that I sometimes play with in here, but I'm not sure will work on this image, is things like Detail Extractor. I do quite like what that's doing to the mountain in the background. I don't think it needs to apply for the rest of the image. And one great thing with Color Efex is we can apply the effects just to part of the image using these control points. And if I just expand this down and tick, we can see where this is applying, and we can increase or decrease the sort of effect radius, move it around, and we can make copies of them. So I'm just going to leave this so it's mostly affecting the mountain at the back. And again, if I just turn that off, I think that does give a little bit more interest to that, that back part of the image. Maybe a little too much, so I'm just going to ease that down again. Maybe to about there. Contrast, too much. Maybe about there. Okay, so I shall save that now and go back into Lightroom. Okay, so back into Lightroom now, and there's the image as we've processed it. And if I just bring up the side-by-side view, that's what we sort of got to on the right-hand side with just the Lightroom edits, and then on the right-hand side now is the changes we've got from Color Efex, which I quite like. I think there's a little bit more detail and drama in the back half of the image. I quite like the slight colour toning from the cross-processing filter. So I think at that point I'm probably going to leave that image. I don't think it immediately needs an awful lot more doing with it. It's not the best picture still. It wasn't the sharpest at the time. It's reasonably sharp, but it was quite windy, and there was nowhere to really stick a tripod around here, if I recall. Very sort of soft mossy ground, and I think I tried and it just sort of sank. So these were mostly shot handheld, which is less than ideal, but it is what it is. Anyway, that's the first image done, and I think time to move on to this next image, which was from the same location, as I say. So I guess the first thing to do is, similar to before, start off maybe with some cropping just to see if that helps. So again, one thing I didn't really like on this picture was when I got it back on the computer, I feel this pink coloured bush on the left hand side is just a bit too dominant, and there's a lot of just sort of dark area of nothing down the bottom. So I thought I would try a 16:9 widescreen type crop, and again move that up just so we keep all the sky in. I think we can just drag in a little bit further. Okay, and again I think similar to the previous one, just losing all that not very interesting foreground makes it into a slightly nicer looking image already to start with. So we'll apply the same basic edits as before, so the landscape profile, hit auto, which obviously just lightens things up a little bit, and again I will set the white balance just off a bit of sky to bring back the warmth that I remember when I was there. Not that much warmth though. Let's pick a different area. It's interesting. Let's try what daylight comes out with. Cloudy. Too orange. I think actually I prefer daylight. I think it's a little bit more neutral, and it's probably the white balance that should be correct for this scene. What I might do is manually just knock that up one notch. I think that probably looks about right. So again, I want to bring out some of the details in this foreground part of the image. So again, I will add a grad filter and just let that fade and add a bit of clarity. Not much, and just a little smidge of texture as well. And again, I want to bring back a little bit of the warmth in the foliage that I remember from when I was there. So again, we'll come through to the yellow and orange sliders and just bring those down a little bit into the sort of orange and red, respectively. Again, we don't need to go crazy. Now, similar to before, I'd also like to do something with the sky. I'm not quite sure a grad filter will work on this because the mountains are fairly prominent as well. Oh, a trick there if you weren't sure, if I just delete that, if I draw that again, if you hold the shift key on your keyboard, it just makes it dead horizontal, so that's a useful little one if you don't want your grad filter to be on the squiff. Okay, so let's knock down the highlights again and the exposure a bit. So it's sort of starting to affect the mountains a little bit. What we can try doing is seeing if the luminance slider option, just come down, helps, because the mountain should be kind of darker than the sky. It kind of works, but I think it's also having a side effect where it loses detail in the mountains as well. But actually, I don't know, maybe there was no detail there to begin with. Not a huge amount. The other option, instead of using a grad filter, of course, is to use a brush. So let's just see if that works any better. So we'll delete that. Load up a fresh brush. And again, just to see where it goes, I will drop the exposure completely down for a moment. And just paint over where we want. I'm not going to worry too much about that little tree. I think trying to go around that's probably not worth the effort. Okay. We can also try popping up the clarity and add a little bit of dehaze as well in the sky maybe. And we've just got a little bit hitting the edge of the landscape there, so I shall just move that up ever so slightly. Okay, I think maybe there's a little bit too much clarity, so knock that back. Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because now we end up with this horrible halo. So I'm going to delete that brush as well. I think we'll see what happens when we go into Color Efex with the various options it has. Maybe we can do something a little bit more subtle on all that. So I'm going to hit done on there and do just that. Hop over into Color Efex, so edit and Color Efex, and wait for that to load. Okay, so here we are. It's pre-applied the last filter I had at the top of my list, which is the cross-processing one again, which I will probably keep because, as I said before, I like the fairly subtle effect it has. But yeah, I find it pleasing. And I will then try adding a neutral grad, see what that does to our sky. And I think that's much nicer than the grad in Lightroom. I think it's more subtle, but still gives a nice effect. Just want to find the right place to have the sort of split point. Obviously we can turn the blend off, which makes it a little bit easier to see where we are aiming. I think about there. Just put a bit of a blend back in again. And then I will also, as before, add the darken, light and centre. That's going to have the advantage of darkening the sky a little bit as well, and then drawing our attention back into the centre of the image. So that's on there. And again, I find that subtle but works really well. And then the last thing I want to do is just experiment with the detail extractor filter which we used on the previous shot. And already we can see that brings out quite a lot of nice extra detail in the mountain there. But again, I don't really want it applying across the foreground. It starts to make things look a little leery. So, similar to before, I will add a control point. We'll start up in this corner, I guess. Turn on that option so we can see where it's applying. Shrink it down a little bit. And just drag a few copies of this around, similar to how we did before. And I might just actually put some up in the sky and turn these right down, which sort of has the effect of stopping it affecting that altogether. I think the sky doesn't want to get too overdone, so we can just again drag some of these around and also just pop one down in here just to stop us affecting the foreground too much. Okay, let's turn those off, and again I think we can knock that back just a little bit, about 19%. Turn up the contrast a little bit. Okay, that's not looking too bad, so I shall save that. And that's going to take it back into Lightroom, and I've just seen the dust spot in this that needs clearing up, so we can do that. We can do that in Lightroom. So just wait for this to finish saving. Okay, and there is the dust spot or two. The tool in Lightroom for doing these isn't actually too bad for a simple spot on a bit of sky. It does a fairly good job. What I will do is just turn on the option to visualize spots which helps you find other ones that might be in the image. You can adjust how sensitive this is, and then you basically look for the little rings. So there's one here and one up in the very top corner. So if I zoom into that location there, there's the spot, not a particularly bad one. And then if we go up in the corner, there's that one. Click to get rid of there. Okay, so those are gone. And again, if we look at the side-by-side view, again, it's a sort of much more colourful image than we started with the original Lightroom processing, and added a bit of interest in the sky from the drama. I guess some of you probably think this is horribly over-processed. I quite like it. I'm not entirely sure about this top corner of the sky. It's gone a little bit green coloured, so whether there's something I can do with that. Again, if we were to sort of position the white balance over there, it goes a bit purpley. So if we undo that, just add a little bit of purple, just to get rid of the worst of the green tinge. Yeah, I think that's a little bit nicer. And what we can also do is actually reset the original back to the starting point. So that's what we began with, and that's what we ended up with. I think it is a bit too colourful. I'm going to just turn the saturation down, about 12%. And the vibrancy a little. And there we go. I think that'll do for that one. I quite like the end result. If you do or don't, feel free to comment again. Okay. See how we do for time. I think for this video that'll probably do. Then I will do another video later on where we look at the other two images. So we have this kind of seascape with the mountains and a dramatic sky, and then these mountains but with lots of horrible clutter. So anyway, I shall pop the completed two images up on the screen now. As ever, thank you for watching. This probably isn't the most interesting video, but it's something to watch when you have completed Netflix or something. Anyway, stay safe, stay indoors. If you're not already subscribed, feel free to click on the subscribe button, and I'll see you again soon.